The stars were dying, one by one, their fading light swallowed by the black gulf, and with each extinguished flame, the galaxy seemed to sigh, as though weary of carrying the weight of endless wars. Broken fortresses drifted in silence, their shattered walls turning slowly in the void, monuments not to glory but to abandonment. On worlds where once armies had marched and banners had flown, only the wind moved now, whispering through charred ruins, scattering ash across forgotten bones. The galaxy had become a graveyard too vast to mourn, and in its shadows, the remnants of the Raven Guard lingered, those who had survived when survival was itself a wound. They were called phantoms by those who half remembered them, warriors who had become whispers, silhouettes, and echoes. And it is here, in this silence, that our tale begins. We want you to know that in this darkness, we truly love and care for you. Before we begin the story in full, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now let us begin. They were few, far fewer than any chapter could sustain, but numbers were not what bound them. What tethered them was memory, as binding and cruel as chains. Their commander, whose name had long been stripped of ceremony, for names belonged to the living, stood at the prow of their battered vessel, the Nocturne's Vigil. His armor was blackened, his left pauldron fractured, and though his eyes burned with a gene-forged fire, they betrayed a hollowness deeper than the void outside. He had endured Istvan, endured the betrayal that had drowned their legion in fire and treachery, endured the endless centuries since, through rituals and forbidden grafts that stretched life into something crueler than death. He had endured because endurance was demanded, but he no longer knew why. Around him, the surviving phantoms moved as shadows do, silent, measured, their presence heavy as dust upon forgotten relics. They no longer spoke of Korax, for his name was a wound too deep to touch. They no longer spoke of the Imperium either, for though they had bled for it, the Imperium had long forgotten them, and yet they clung to a duty none could name, as if the act of holding a vigil was itself enough to ward away oblivion. The ship drifted near a dying star, its light brittle like the last flame of a candle in a tomb. The commander watched its final pulses, each flicker reminding him of brothers long gone. He thought of Kalen, who had laughed before the drop on Istvan, laughter that still echoed in his skull. He thought of Duras, who had sworn they would rebuild, even as fire consumed them. Ghosts crowded him more densely than his surviving brothers ever could, and in that press of phantoms, he wondered what remained of himself. Was he a leader, a guardian, or simply another shadow clinging to a war that had ended before memory itself? He raised his hand, and the few gathered answered the unspoken command. They moved to the strategium, where a star chart flickered with failing clarity. The galaxy unfolded in dying lines of light, and their paths of exile lay marked across a dozen forgotten systems. Some worlds were marked with small symbols, records of hiding places, caches, and graves. Others bore no marks at all, voids where their kind had vanished without a whisper. He traced a path with his gauntleted finger, hesitating as though each decision carved another wound. "We remain," one of the phantoms finally spoke, his voice quiet, almost reverent. It was not a declaration, nor a question, but an offering. The commander turned his eyes toward him. It was Loran, one of the youngest by the measure of war, though even he bore centuries etched into his flesh. His face was pale beneath the scarred helm, his expression carved with the same silence that bound them all. Yet in his tone there had been something else, conviction, or perhaps defiance. "Remain for what?" the commander asked, his voice a low echo that seemed to fill the chamber. "For whom?" No one answered. Silence was heavier than chains, and it stretched between them until the ship itself groaned beneath its weight. Each of them bore the same question, though none dared speak it. Duty was the marrow of their existence. But duty to what, when all they had served had forgotten them? The star outside flared one last time, a final convulsion of dying light before collapsing into the dark. Its death was silent, but it seemed to ripple through the ship, through the hearts of all who watched. The commander lowered his head as though the extinguished flame had been kin. In truth, it had. They were that star, burning long beyond reason, destined to collapse. A voice stirred in the silence, distant yet uncomfortably near. It came not from the phantoms, but from the ship itself, from the long-dead vox channels that should have been silent. A fragment of a message, fractured by time, whispered across the chamber. The raven still watches. Shadows remain. Prophecy. Unseen. The words broke, dissolved into static, then returned. The phantoms, not forgotten. The commander's eyes narrowed. The voice was old, impossibly old, yet it carried weight. A signal out of time, echoing from a forgotten past or perhaps a shadowed future. His brothers shifted uneasily, their silence broken not by words, but by the raw edge of fear and longing. To be remembered, after so long, was more dangerous than to be forgotten. He dismissed them with a gesture, though his own thoughts roared louder than any battle. The message clawed at him, awakening something buried beneath layers of resignation. If prophecy bound them, then perhaps their vigil was not merely endless wandering, but what did it mean to be named in whispers? Was it salvation or another trap like Istvan had been? The Nocturne's vigil continued its slow drift, engines quiet, as if the ship itself pondered the message. The crew moved, like shades, whispering to each other without sound, their loyalty unshaken, but their hearts restless. Some would cling to the message as proof of purpose. Others would fear it, believing prophecy to be chains forged in the warp. And the commander, bound in silence, carried both hopes and fears like weights upon his shoulders. He stood alone at the viewport, watching the dark where the star had died. In the glass, his reflection was fractured, a shadow with hollow eyes. He reached for the memory of his own name, but it dissolved like dust. All he had now was the vigil and the whisper of prophecy. Yet for the first time in centuries, a choice loomed before him, sharp and terrible. He did not know whether to grasp it or let it pass like another dying star. The ship shuddered, as if the void itself had answered his indecision. And in that moment, as silence fell heavier than ever before, the long vigil of the phantoms stirred towards something that might yet be called destiny. The memory of Istvan never left them. It clung to their armor, settled in the silence between words, breathed through every scar carved into flesh and steel. The commander closed his eyes, and the past came unbidden, flooding like ash upon the wind. He remembered the skies torn by fire, the thunder of orbital bombardments that had rained death upon loyal brothers, the black sand shifting beneath boots already slick with blood. He remembered the betrayal that had come not from alien hands, but from kin, from those they had trusted most. Even now, centuries later, the taste of betrayal was iron in his mouth, a bitterness that immortality could not dull. They had descended that day with purpose, their faith in the Imperium unbroken, their loyalty to Korax unquestioned. The Emperor's vision had been a light to guide them, and they had carried it into the furnace of Istvan. But as the fire rose and the ground became a tomb, they had understood too late. Horus had orchestrated the massacre, and the sons of the Emperor had butchered each other. The commander had watched proud legions crushed under betrayal, their banners turned to kindling. He had felt his own brothers torn apart, not by Xenos or heretics, but by the ones they had once called allies. That wound had never healed. It had only deepened until even the stars seemed complicit in their silence. Within the Nocturne's vigil, the warriors stirred uneasily as those memories bled into the present. They had long stopped speaking of Istvan openly, but none among them had ever escaped its shadow. Every phantom carried fragments of that betrayal carved into their soul. Some had found solace in silence, retreating into the ritual of survival. Others nursed their anger in secret, a fire too dangerous to reveal. The commander saw it in their movements, in the quiet rigidity of their stares, the way their hands lingered too long over weapon grips. Two stood apart, though never far enough to ignore each other. Loran, whose voice had dared to break the silence, carried himself with a conviction not found in most of their kin. His armor was scarred but well kept, the purity seals faded yet intact, and his gaze, though shadowed, still burned with the hope of something more. Beside him, or rather against him, was Kador, whose loyalty had withered into cynicism long ago. Kador bore his wounds openly, cracks across his armor left unpolished, a scar across his face that he never masked. His voice was sharp when he chose to use it, which was seldom, but the weight of his contempt needed no words. "They tell us we are remembered," Loran murmured as they walked the corridors, his voice just above a whisper. "That the phantoms are named in prophecy. Perhaps our vigil is not meaningless." Kador laughed, though it was a hollow sound. "Prophecy. Words spat from the warp, nothing more. Shadows whisper to shadows, and you call it destiny. I call it the cruelest jest. We bleed, we drift, we die. That is all." The commander overheard their voices echo faintly, though he did not intervene. He had long learned that silence taught truths louder than rebuke. Still, the divide between them grew daily, a fracture he knew would one day shatter. Later, when the vessel reached the orbit of a long-dead world, they descended. Its surface was ash and ruin, a grave without mourners. Once it had been an outpost, a refuge carved for Raven Guard who had fled Istvan's fire. Now it was dust. The commander walked among its ruins, his boots pressing into the brittle remains of what had been halls of strategy, training grounds, sanctums for oaths. Shattered statues of warriors still stood in fragments, their features worn into unrecognizable shadows. He touched one, gauntleted fingers brushing stone that crumbled to powder. Beneath the ruin, they uncovered a hidden chamber. The air was stale, heavy with centuries of silence, but its walls bore inscriptions scratched into metal by desperate hands. Names lined the chamber, thousands etched with ritualistic care, each one a brother, each one a phantom that had not survived. The commander traced them with his hand, his breath caught in his chest. Memory flooded again. Voices, laughter, the brief warmth of comradeship before the flames had claimed it all. He felt their absence as though the galaxy itself hollowed around him. The inscriptions did not end with names. Deeper into the chamber, carved into the farthest wall, was a vow. The words were jagged, cut with trembling hands, yet the weight of their promise carried through time. The vigil shall not break. We are shadows, and shadows endure. The silence that followed was suffocating. The warriors who stood with him bowed their heads, some in reverence, others in doubt. Loran's eyes gleamed faintly, as though the vow had reignited a purpose within him. Kador's lips curled in disdain. "Shadows endure," he muttered, "until they fade into nothing. Tell me, Commander, Is this endurance, or is it decay? The commander did not answer. His silence was not indecision, but a wound too deep to give voice. Yet within him the question writhed. Was their survival an act of defiance, or was it cowardice? Were they guardians of memory, or prisoners of a war that had ended long ago? He could not untangle the truth. As they left the chamber, the static voice returned through the Vigils, the same broken cadence fractured by time. The raven still watches, unseen wings. Prophecy unfolds. The words slithered through their minds like a dagger, stirring hope in some and dread in others. The commander's hand tightened on his blade, though he knew no foe had spoken them. The warp was treacherous, yet sometimes truth bled through lies, and sometimes lies wore the mask of truth. That night, if night could be called the turning of time aboard a drifting vessel, the commander dreamt. In the dream, he walked the fields of Istvan once more, but the ground did not bleed. Instead, it was silent, the corpses of his brothers turning their hollow eyes upon him. They whispered, though their mouths did not move. We endured, so you might decide. The words echoed until he awoke, his breath ragged, his fists clenched. Decision. The word haunted him. He had not chosen anything in centuries, only endured. But now the galaxy seemed to lean toward him, pressing him with the weight of choice. He wondered if this was what prophecy demanded. Not salvation, not triumph, but the cruel necessity of decision. He walked again to the viewport, staring into the void where stars burned weak and pale. Loran stood not far, his eyes fixed upon the same horizon. Kador lingered behind, silent but watchful, his contempt sharpening into something colder. Between them stretched a gulf greater than any void. The commander knew it was a fracture that prophecy or war would soon tear open. The galaxy beyond lay in ruin, but within these shadows the true battle loomed. Loyalty against despair, memory against oblivion, brother against brother. The vigil endured, but endurance was not peace. It was a blade, waiting for the moment to fall. And when it did, it would carve not only the phantoms, but the very meaning of their existence. The chamber below the ruins had not finished yielding its secrets. For days the phantoms lingered there, combing through dust-choked passages and collapsed corridors, as though the stones themselves might whisper truth. The commander walked the halls with deliberate silence, his every step echoing through the tomb of forgotten brothers. Rusted lamps lined the walls, their light long extinguished. Yet the inscriptions carved into the metal remained, etched deep enough to outlast centuries of decay. Among the names and vows, one wall had been marked with a sigil, a raven's wing stretched wide, talons reaching for something unseen. Beneath it, more words. The oath of silence binds us. The shadows shall not speak until the hour comes. The commander stared at those words longer than he wished, the silence pressing against his ears. He felt as though the inscription was not a relic of the dead, but a commandment written for him alone, echoing across time. He reached out and traced the lines of the sigil with his gauntlet, dust crumbling beneath the touch. The wing seemed alive, as though carved not to endure, but to wait. Behind him, Loran's voice broke the stillness. They swore silence as a shield, to remain unseen until the hour of need. Perhaps it is upon us now. Kador snorted, his disdain unhidden. Or perhaps they died whispering to ghosts, waiting for an hour that never came. Do you see salvation in dust, brother? I see only chains. The commander turned, his gaze cutting through them both. He did not raise his voice. He had no need. His silence was command enough, and the two warriors fell quiet, though the air between them crackled with unspoken fury. Later, when the warriors gathered in the strategium, the commander called them to the table, where star charts flickered in pale light. The system they now drifted in was marked with faint sigils, remnants of ancient campaigns. The forge world below had died in fire, its forges long cold, but its records suggested hidden vaults, arms, armor, perhaps relics untouched by raiders or scavengers. He spoke few words, but each landed with weight. We search, we uncover. If prophecy names us, then truth will be found here. The phantoms nodded, though unease moved among them, like a shadow in water. To follow a whisper, to obey a message born from static and ruin, was to court danger. Yet silence was more dangerous still. Without purpose, they would crumble into nothing, scattered like dust on the void. The descent into the forge world was slow, their vessel cutting through layers of ash that hung in the atmosphere like a shroud. The surface stretched endless, plains of iron slag and collapsed manufactoria towers jutting into the sky like broken teeth. Black winds scoured the land, carrying echoes that might have been the cries of long-dead workers. The commander led them through the ruins, his cloak trailing over fractured stone, his steps unerring, as though guided by something unseen. Within the depths of a collapsed forge hall, they found a vault sealed by iron doors. Ancient sigils lined its surface, etched with the mark of the raven. The doors bore scars of attempts to breach them, gouges from claws, blasts from weapons, yet none had pierced their surface. The phantoms stood before it in silence, their reflections warped in the scorched metal. The commander placed his hand against the door, and for a moment it felt warm beneath his palm, as though something still lived within. They forced the doors open, the sound tearing through the dead halls like a scream. Inside lay rows of armor, not gleaming, but black as shadow, adorned with inscriptions of oaths and silent vows. Weapons lay stacked in racks, their edges keen despite centuries of disuse. But beyond the war gear, in the farthest recess, stood a single dais. Upon it rested a device unlike the rest, an ancient vox relay, cracked but humming faintly with impossible power. Its light pulsed in rhythm, like a dying heart refusing to stop. As the commander approached, the device sputtered to life, its speakers crackling with the same fractured voice they had heard before. The raven watches. The hour is near. Shadows must rise. The words staggered, breaking, yet the intent was clear. The phantoms stood transfixed, caught between reverence and fear. Some bowed their heads, as though in prayer. Others glanced uneasily, their hands twitching toward their weapons, as though the vox were a trap. Kador broke the silence, his voice sharp as a blade. This is madness. Ghosts speaking from broken machines, and you would follow them? Are we so desperate that we cling to lies carved in dust? Loran's reply came swift, his tone edged with fire. And what would you have us do? Drift until even we forget who we were? If prophecy calls us, we must answer. Better to rise and fall than vanish as cowards. Their voices clashed in the chamber, echoing against the walls heavy with vows. The commander raised his hand, and the silence returned, heavier than any argument. He looked upon the device, its light pulsing faintly, and within him conflict tore like claws. The voice had named them, had bound them to something more than endurance. Yet to follow it was to risk damnation, for the warp spoke often in half-truths. That night, aboard the Nocturne's Vigil, the commander did not sleep. He sat alone in the strategium, the starlight washing across his armor, reflecting like fading embers. In his mind, he saw again the dying star collapsing into dark, the vow carved into stone, the voice whispering across centuries. He thought of Korax, his Primarch, lost in shadow, and wondered if this path was his legacy or his betrayal. The ship groaned, its frame shifting as though restless. The warriors stirred uneasily, dreams plagued by voices that were not their own. Even in silence, the oath carved into the forge seemed to echo within their skulls. We are shadows, and shadows endure. But endurance alone no longer seemed enough. Purpose, whether forged by prophecy or lies, now pressed upon them like the weight of a dying galaxy. The commander rose, his decision unspoken, yet in his silence every warrior felt it. The vigil would change. Whether it would rise into salvation or fall into damnation, none could yet know. The stars outside flickered as though listening, their light thin and fragile against the void. In that light, the phantoms prepared themselves, their weapons oiled, their armor sealed, their vows unspoken but burning. The oath of silence bound them still, yet within that silence a storm was forming. Shadows had endured, but now shadows would be forced to choose, remain unseen or step into the dying light of a galaxy that had long forgotten them. The oath of silence hung over them like a shroud, binding their tongues even as their hearts screamed with conflict. The relic vault had armed them, clothed them once more in the black of their ancestors, and yet with every plate they fastened, with every oath they spoke in unspoken breath, they became something heavier. They were no longer mere survivors drifting between forgotten stars. They had been given a charge, though none could name its source. The commander walked among them, his shadow long against the dim lumen of the strategium. He felt their eyes upon him, waiting, pleading, defying. He gave no order, for his silence was both shield and prison. Loran approached him when the others had drifted into their own private rituals. His young features, made old by centuries of exile, bore a brightness that clashed with the gloom. He bowed his head slightly before speaking, his voice low but steady. We cannot remain in silence forever. The voice, the vow, they compel us. To endure is not enough. To endure is to waste what was given. His eyes lifted, burning with conviction. We must act. The galaxy has forgotten us, yes, but that does not absolve us. If prophecy names us, then we cannot turn away. Not now. Before the commander could answer, Kador's voice sliced into the chamber, as sharp as a blade dragged across stone. And if prophecy damns us, what if every whisper you cling to is the warp's laughter, bait for fools? Look around you, Loran. Look at us. Half men, half shadows. Bound by rituals that should never have been, stretching our lives into mockeries of what we once were. Do you think we are chosen? No, we are cursed, chained to endurance while everything we loved rotted away. His steps echoed as he drew nearer, his face hard, his scar catching the weak light. I will not be the pawn of ghosts. If you would follow these whispers, then you follow them without me. The commander's eyes met Kaidor's, and in that gaze lingered something unspoken. Warning, sorrow, recognition. They had fought side by side on Istvan, had carved paths through betrayal and flame. To see Kador's fire bent into bitterness was another wound, one that cut deeper than steel. Yet he said nothing. He let the silence draw itself around them, heavy as iron. Loran bristled, fists clenched at his sides, but the commander's stillness restrained him. The ship drifted onward, the void swallowing all sound but the hum of engines. Days blurred into one another, though time had little meaning for those who had long abandoned mortal reckoning. In the dim-lit chapel of the vessel, the phantoms gathered before broken icons of the Emperor, their wings folded in shadow. Some prayed, their voices whispers too faint to carry. Others sharpened blades or polished relic armor, each act a ritual of memory more than preparation. Yet in every gesture, doubt crept like a serpent, winding tighter with each passing cycle. At last, the commander summoned them. They gathered in the strategium once more, their black armor arrayed in grim silence, eyes reflecting the dying light of the star map. He stood before them, a figure carved from shadow, his voice a low thunder that rolled across the chamber. The oath of silence binds us, but silence is not without cost. We endure, but endurance is no victory. We are remembered in prophecy. Whether as warning or salvation, I do not know. But the vigil cannot remain unchanged. The choice lies before us, to remain shadows, unseen, until we wither into nothing, or to step into the dying light and bear the consequence of that choice. The room pulsed with unspoken tension. Lauren stepped forward, his voice ringing with conviction. I will not fade into dust. I will follow the voice, even if it leads into fire. He turned to the others, his gaze unflinching. We were not forged to wither. We were forged to endure for a purpose. And if we cannot find it, then we will make one. Kador's laughter cut through, harsh and bitter. And when that purpose destroys you, when the Imperium you cling to rejects you once more, or the warp devours you, what then? You think endurance is weakness? Endurance is truth. To act is to invite ruin. Perhaps that is what you desire, a noble death, wrapped in lies. I will not march into damnation draped in prophecy. A murmur spread through the gathered warriors, some leaning toward Loran's fire, others recoiling into Kaidor's bitterness. The fracture widened, silent but undeniable, running like a crack through the stone of their unity. The commander felt it press against his chest, a weight he could not shake. He thought of the vow carved into the wall, of the whisper that named them, of the dream where corpses had spoken. He thought of Istvan and of brothers who had believed in purpose until fire consumed them. He wondered if he now stood upon the same precipice. That night, the commander wandered the ship alone. The corridors stretched endless, lined with rust and shadow, the air filled with the faint hum of failing machinery. He walked to the armory, where relics of their past stood like sentinels. His hand traced the edge of a bolter, older than memory, its metal cold, its inscriptions nearly worn smooth. He remembered the brother who had carried it, remembered the laughter that had once filled these halls. Silence now filled the space where life had been. He moved then to the viewing deck, where the stars sprawled like a tapestry of wounds across the void. A dying sun pulsed in the distance, its light fragile, its death inevitable. He thought of it as a mirror, a reflection of the phantoms themselves, burning long beyond reason, destined to collapse into shadow. His reflection stared back at him in the glass, hollow-eyed, a spectre draped in black. Behind him, a presence stirred. Kador stepped into the chamber, his voice low, almost weary. Do you see it, Commander? The futility. We cling to ashes, convinced they are flame. But I will not follow into madness. When the time comes, I will choose my own path. His eyes narrowed, the scar pulling at his lips. And if others follow me, then so be it. I will not let us all burn for the sake of whispers. The commander met his gaze, and though no words passed between them, the truth was plain. The fracture was no longer a shadow. It was a blade, and soon it would cut. Kador left, his footsteps fading into the distance, and the commander was alone once more, watching as the dying sun flickered and dimmed. His silence was no longer endurance but torment. He knew the vigil had changed. Soon, choice would demand its due. Shadows could not endure forever without breaking. and when they did, the galaxy itself would feel their fall. The warp pressed against the hull like a living sea, its tides whispering, unseen yet felt in every shudder of the vessel. The Nocturne's Vigil drifted through its currents with the grace of a wounded predator, silent engines pulsing faintly as though reluctant to disturb the dark. Within its walls, the phantoms moved as shades through shadow, their rituals sharpening into something more restless. The oath of silence bound their tongues, but their thoughts screamed, haunted by whispers that were not their own. The warp was never still, and those who carried wounds as deep as theirs drew its gaze as carrion draws flies. The commander stood in the chapel, staring at the broken icons, their gilt faded to dull iron. Shadows pooled in the corners, and within them he thought he saw movement, figures shifting, indistinct, watching with hollow patience. He closed his eyes, but the vision did not fade. Instead, a voice coiled into his mind, silken and cruel. You endure. You suffer. Why cling to silence when eternity waits to embrace you? He clenched his fists, nails biting into his palms. It was not the first time the warp had sought him, nor would it be the last. Yet the words dug deeper now, for they echoed the very doubts Kador had spoken aloud. Elsewhere in the ship, warriors whispered in their sleep. Dreams plagued them, heavy with fire and the faces of dead brothers. Some awoke trembling, others screaming without sound. Loran walked among them, offering presence if not comfort, his faith anchoring him against the tide. Yet even he could not ignore the shadows that curled along the corridors, flickers of black that vanished when faced. He confided once, his voice low, that he had dreamt of Korax, though he dared not claim it, vision or truth. In the dream, their Primarch had turned away from him, wings spread, vanishing into endless night. Kador, in contrast, embraced the whispers. He stood alone in the armory, staring into the reflections on blackened steel. His lips moved, though no voice escaped them, as if conversing with something unseen. His eyes gleamed faintly in the dim light, not with conviction, but with the fevered spark of one who has already chosen. The warp fed him visions, of strength reclaimed, of legions reborn, of shadows that no longer fled the light but consumed it. Each night, those visions grew sharper, and each morning he emerged colder, more certain. The commander felt the division deepen, subtle yet undeniable. The phantoms no longer moved as one, their silence fractured into currents pulling in opposite directions. Loran gathered those who still clung to duty, reminding them of vows carved into stone, of prophecy naming them. Kador whispered to others in shadow, and though none spoke of it aloud, the commander saw the shift in their eyes, the way they lingered near him, the way their silence bent toward his gravity. One cycle, as the Nocturne's Vigil slipped between dying stars, their augurs caught an anomaly. A Forge World's carcass drifted nearby, but at its heart pulsed something unnatural. A beacon, not of man, but of the warp. Its light shimmered like a wound in reality, bleeding across their scanners. The commander gathered his warriors, and they descended into its hollow shell. The world was dead, its forges silent, its skies filled with ash. Towers of broken metal clawed upward, their spires twisting as though melted by fire not of this galaxy. As they moved deeper, the air grew heavy, thick with whispers that slid into their minds like knives. Some fell to their knees, clutching helmets, their silence broken by ragged breaths. Others pressed on, grim determination etched into every step. At the heart of the forge, they found it, a chamber where reality bent, walls warped as though half consumed by flame. In its center lay a crystal, black as void, its surface cracked with crimson veins that pulsed in rhythm like a beating heart. The air trembled with its power, and the whispers rose, voices layering until they became a choir of the damned. Loran stepped forward, his blade raised, voice steady though his breath shook. "It is corruption. We destroy it." Kador moved to block him, his eyes alight, his tone almost reverent. "No, this is power. Do you not feel it? It calls to us, because it knows us. We are forgotten by the Imperium, cast aside. Here lies a truth that will not abandon us." His voice deepened, tinged with the resonance of something other. "With this, we can be more than shadows. We can be eternal." The silence that followed was unbearable, each warrior caught between faith and temptation. The commander's gaze swept across them, seeing doubt, fear, hunger in their eyes. He felt the weight of their unspoken question pressing into him. Was this prophecy's promise, or damnation's snare? The crystal pulsed brighter, and the whispers dug deeper. He heard voices, Kalen's laughter, Durus's oath, names carved into stone, all twisted into pleas. "We endured so you would choose. We endured so you would act." He staggered under the weight of it, his silence no longer armor, but suffocation. Loran struck first, his blade slashing toward the crystal, sparks of red fire flaring where steel met unnatural stone. The chamber shook, the whispers rising to screams. Kador roared and struck him aside, the clash of their blades ringing like thunder in the forge. Sparks danced across their armor as they fought, silence broken at last by the fury of brother against brother. The commander moved between them, his blade drawn, forcing them apart with the weight of his presence. His voice, rarely heard, tore through the chamber, low and commanding. "Enough!" It echoed, shaking the very air, a sound that silenced even the crystal for a heartbeat. But silence did not last. Kaidor's voice, fevered and raw, spilled into the void. "You would cling to oaths that brought us only ruin. I will not die a shadow. I will not fade into dust. I will take what the warp offers, and I will carve purpose from it." Loran, blood on his lips, raised his blade again. "Then you are already lost." The commander stood between them, torn by the weight of choice. His silence had endured centuries, but silence could not hold forever. The crystal pulsed, the whispers screamed, and in that moment, the Vigil trembled on the edge of fracture. He knew the decision would come, and when it did, it would not only divide them, it would define them. The forge groaned, metal collapsing under the weight of forces not meant for mortal eyes. The phantoms staggered back, their armor scraped by invisible claws, their minds filled with the howling of things unseen. The commander raised his hand, signaling retreat, and though Kador hesitated, even he obeyed. They fled into the dying light, leaving the crystal pulsing in the darkness, its whispers chasing them through the corridors. Back aboard the Nocturne's Vigil, silence returned, but it was no longer the silence of unity. It was the silence before a storm, heavy, suffocating, inevitable. The commander stood at the viewport, watching the forge world burn as its core collapsed, the crystal's glow vanishing into the abyss. He felt no triumph, only the weight of what had been revealed. The Vigil had endured, but endurance was no longer enough. The shadows had been given a choice, and choice would tear them apart. The fracture within the phantoms had deepened into something visible, a shadow not merely felt, but seen in the way brothers moved around one another, in the way silence was no longer unity, but tension drawn taut. Loran and Kador did not speak, not even to mask their contempt with civility. They carried it in their postures, in the way their eyes refused to meet, in the way their followers drifted closer to one side or the other. The commander walked among them like a spectre binding frayed strands together, Yet even his presence could not erase the truth. A wound had opened, and wounds fester if not cut out. The memory of the crystal haunted them, its whispers trailing into dreams. Some of the phantoms woke, screaming, hands clawing at their helmets as though to tear out the voices. Others woke in silence, eyes cold, their lips curling into grim smiles that betrayed their allegiance to Kaidor's vision. Only a few still carried the fire of faith in their bearing, standing near Loran as if his conviction could shield them. The commander bore witness to all of it, his own silence breaking him apart, because he knew he could not delay forever. A choice would come. It was already here. The duel was inevitable. It began not in words, for silence was their heritage, but in a glance sharpened into steel. It was Kaidor who first stepped into the center of the training hall, his black armor reflecting the dim red glow of the lumen strips. He drew his blade slowly, the sound of metal whispering against its sheath, cutting through the quiet like a wound. He did not speak, but his intent filled the chamber. Loran entered moments later, summoned by nothing but instinct. His own blade already drawn, his features grim but unshaken. The other phantoms gathered, silent as wraiths, their boots striking the metal floor in a cadence that echoed across the hall. No one moved to stop what was about to unfold. It was ritual, inevitable as the orbit of stars, as old as betrayal itself. The commander arrived last, his shadow falling across them, his gaze cold and watchful. He did not halt them. He could not. This was no quarrel to be silenced with orders. This was a fracture that demanded blood. Kaidor lunged first, his strike sharp, merciless, fueled by the bitterness that had consumed him. Loran met it with precision, his blade sparking as it deflected the blow. They moved with a ferocity that belied their age, their black armor colliding, blades hissing through the stale air. Every strike was a sentence unspoken, every parry a word left unsaid. The clash of their blades was their only language, and it spoke of division, of rage, of a vigil no longer whole. The others watched, their faces unreadable behind helmets, but their hearts choosing in silence. Some clenched fists as Loran's blade found Kaidor's shoulder, sparks flying, the wound shallow but marking him. Others leaned forward as Kaidor retaliated, his strike hammering against Loran's guard, nearly driving him to his knees. It was not merely a duel between two warriors. It was the embodiment of their legion's fracture, fought in silence beneath the eyes of their commander. The commander stood unmoving, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze never leaving them. He felt every strike as though it were his own, every wound a reflection of his failure to bind them. The prophecy whispered still in his mind, its words haunting, and he wondered if this was what had been foretold. Not salvation, not purpose, but the slow death of shadows devouring themselves. Kaidor pressed harder, his strikes wild, carrying the weight of desperation. He spat words at last, breaking the oath, his voice raw with fury. You call this loyalty? You call this purpose? We rot because of your faith, Loran. We rot while the warp offers us eternity. His blade slashed, carving sparks from the floor, as Loran barely avoided the blow. Loran's voice answered, steady, even as blood seeped from a cut along his arm. Eternity in chains is no eternity. I would rather fall in silence than kneel in corruption. He struck, his blade carving across Kaidor's gauntlet, biting through armor, drawing a snarl of pain. Their duel raged, faster, harder, their bodies colliding with the force of centuries of rage unleashed. Armor cracked, blood spilled, the floor slick with the fragments of their oath. The watchers did not move. They could not. They were bound to witness, to let this fracture carve its truth in steel and blood. At last, Kador drove Loran against the wall, his blade pressed to his throat, his face twisted in triumph and fury. "Then die as the coward you are," he hissed, pressing harder, the tip of his blade biting against armor. But before he could finish, the commander's hand shot forward, faster than thought. His blade interposed itself, catching Kador's weapon with a force that rang like thunder. For the first time in centuries, the commander spoke, his voice low, cold, undeniable. "Enough!" The word froze the chamber. Kador snarled, his breath harsh, but the commander's gaze held him in place, unflinching, immovable. Slowly, with trembling fury, Kador lowered his blade, stepping back, his chest heaving. Loran sagged against the wall, blood dripping from his wounds, but his eyes never left Kador's. The commander stood between them, his silence broken once more. "You would tear us apart before the galaxy does. You would fracture the Vigil before its hour comes. If prophecy names us, then it is not by your blade, Kador, nor by your faith, Loran. It is by the choice I have yet to make. Until then, you will not raise your blades against each other again." His voice carried not just command, but judgment, and it bound them as surely as chains. Kador turned sharply, his face twisted with defiance, but he said nothing. He stormed from the hall, his footsteps echoing like thunder, his followers drifting after him. Loran remained, leaning against the wall, his breath ragged, his faith unshaken though his body bled. The others dispersed slowly, their silence heavier than before, each carrying the weight of what they had seen. The fracture had not been mended, only stayed by the hand of their commander. But everyone knew it had not ended. It had only been delayed. When the hall was empty, the commander stood alone, his blade still in hand, his reflection broken in its steel. He thought of the vow, of the prophecy, of the voices whispering from the warp. He thought of the sun that had died before his eyes, and he wondered if their vigil would end the same way, collapsing, consuming itself, leaving nothing but silence. Outside the ship, the void stretched infinite, the stars cold and distant. The Nocturne's vigil drifted on, its hull scarred, its crew fractured, its silence trembling with the weight of choice. And somewhere in the warp, the whispers laughed. For they knew the fracture had already begun. The silence that followed the duel was not peace. It was a silence heavy with the sound of unshed words, of blades unsheathed in the heart, though not in the hand. The Nocturne's vigil drifted through the void like a wounded leviathan, its engines barely pulsing, its halls echoing with the steps of warriors who no longer trusted the ground beneath them. The fracture had been stayed, but not healed. Each phantom carried it in his gait, in the set of his jaw, in the way his eyes lingered on his brothers, as if measuring them as both ally and foe. The commander walked the corridors alone. His presence still bound them together, but only barely, like threads stretched too thin over a wound that could not close. He felt the pressure of their division in every glance, in every pause of silence. His silence had been his armor, but now it became his burden, for silence was no longer enough. The choice he had delayed now pressed in on him from all sides, demanding to be made. It was during this uneasy drifting that their augurs shrieked warning. A shadow cut across the stars, brutish, ragged, alive with savage energy. Orcs. A warband prowled the void, their ships crude but vicious, their engines burning with reckless hunger. The phantoms gathered in the strategium, their black armor catching the dying light of the hololithic displays. The commander stood at the center, watching as crude green symbols swarmed across the projection, moving toward them like predators scenting blood. They come for war, Loran said, his voice steady, though his gaze lingered on the flickering shapes. And we cannot remain shadows now. We must fight or be consumed. Kador's laugh was low, bitter. How fitting. The galaxy itself tests us. Will you pray to your silent vows, Loran, while these beasts tear us apart? Or will you admit that only power will save us? His eyes flicked to the commander, sharp, fevered. This is the proof. Shadows cannot endure against flame. We must become more. The commander raised a hand, silencing them both, though the tension between their words clung to the chamber. He studied the projection with eyes hollow, yet unflinching. The orcs came fast, eager, loud in their intent, a tide of noise and fury against their silence. There was no choice now but battle. The order was given, unspoken, yet understood, and the Nocturne's vigil stirred from its drifting. Engines roared, weapons primed, shields hummed with a strength not called upon in centuries. The phantoms prepared, their armor sealed, their blades oiled, their bolters loaded. They moved through the ship with ritualistic precision, their silence now heavy with anticipation. Each warrior knew this could be their end, and yet in their hearts there was a grim relief. To fight was simpler than to endure the slow fracture of silence. The battle came swiftly. Orc ships burst from the void like predators, their crude hulls scarred and bristling with weapons. The Nocturne's vigil met them with silent fury, lances of fire ripping through their ranks, bolter batteries pounding into their crude armor. The void lit with flame, wreckage scattering like ash across the stars. Yet for every ship destroyed, more came, their laughter and war cries spilling into the comms, a tide that did not fear death. The phantoms struck back with precision. Boarding pods slammed into orc hulks, and black-armored figures spilled into their corridors like shadows, cutting through the green tide with blades and bolters. The orcs roared, their axes hacking, their guns spraying wild arcs of fire. But the phantoms moved like wraiths, silent, efficient, merciless. Blood soaked the decks, metal screamed, and the silence of the Raven Guard clashed against the chaos of orc war cries. The commander fought among them, his blade flashing, his silence more commanding than any roar. He carved through orcs with a grim inevitability, his strikes measured, unyielding. Yet as he fought, he felt the fracture even here. Loran fought with a purity of purpose, every strike measured as though carved from vow. Kador fought with abandon, his blade tearing through flesh with fury, his laughter low, bitter, carrying through the vox as though he revelled in the slaughter. His followers mirrored him, their silence cracked by snarls, their precision slipping into frenzy. The battle raged, decks running red, void lit by fire. The commander pressed forward, his warriors at his side, yet he felt the fracture tearing wider with every strike. The orcs were not the true enemy. They were only the fire that revealed the weakness of the steel. At last, the orc warlord came, a beast of metal and muscle, towering, its axe crackling with crude energy, its laughter shaking the very air. It bellowed a challenge, its voice echoing across the decks. The commander stepped forward, his blade ready, his silence absolute. The clash shook the ship, steel against crude energy, silence against noise. The orc roared with every strike, its strength titanic, but the commander met it with grim inevitability. Each blow deflected, each strike driven with purpose. The duel raged, sparks flying, blood spilling. The orc's axe tore gouges into the deck, the commander's blade carving through armor and flesh. At last, with a final thrust, the commander drove his blade through the warlord's chest. The beast roared one last time, its voice fading into silence as it fell, shaking the deck with its death. The battle waned, the orcs routed, their ships breaking, their cries fading into the void. The phantoms stood bloodied but victorious, their silence heavy with the cost. The ship bore wounds, its hull scarred, its decks broken, but it endured. Yet even in victory, the fracture deepened. Loran knelt beside the fallen, his blade dripping, his breath steady. "We endure," he whispered, as though to himself, his eyes burning with conviction. Kador stood apart, his face twisted in grim satisfaction. Blood splattered across his armor. His eyes met the commander's, and in them burned a truth the commander could no longer ignore. Kador did not see victory in endurance. He saw only the promise of more power, more blood, more freedom from the silence that bound them. The commander looked across his warriors, saw the divide carved sharper by the battle. Some stood with Loran, silent, loyal, their faith renewed in the vow. Others drifted near Kador, their silence cracked, their eyes gleaming with hunger. The fracture was no longer hidden. It was open, bleeding, undeniable. The void outside was littered with burning wreckage, stars cold and distant beyond it. The Nocturne's Vigil floated amid the ruin, victorious yet broken. The commander stood at the viewport, his reflection fractured in the glass. He saw himself as shadow, as ghost, as a man bound by silence yet demanded to choose. The battle had been won, but the true war had only begun. And it was not against the orcs, nor any enemy of flesh and blood. It was against themselves, against the silence that had once bound them and now threatened to devour them whole. The fires of battle had barely cooled when the true wound opened. The decks of the Nocturne's Vigil reeked of blood and oil, orc carcasses dragged aside, brothers tending to wounds that would never heal in spirit, even if the flesh endured. Victory was theirs, but victory felt hollow. The silence that settled upon them was different from the silence of their heritage. It was strained, fractured, broken by glances that lingered too long, and the sharp edges of unspoken words. The commander walked among them, his armor rent, his blade still streaked with orc gore. Warriors bowed their heads as he passed, but their deference was not unity. It was a fragile obedience, thin as glass. Some eyes burned with reverence, others with doubt, still others with hunger. He felt the weight of every gaze, and he knew the vigil could not hold much longer. It was Kador who shattered the illusion first. He gathered his followers in the shadows of the lower decks, their armor scarred, their faces grim. His voice was low, almost reverent, yet carrying the force of certainty. You saw what happened. You felt it. The orcs were nothing compared to what lies ahead. We won not because of silence, not because of vows carved in dust, but because we unleashed ourselves. Because we stopped pretending that shadows could endure against fire. The galaxy has cast us aside, but the warp has not. It speaks. It offers. It promises more than endurance. It promises eternity. His words slithered into ears desperate for meaning, and some nodded, their silence shifting into allegiance. Loran, meanwhile, gathered others in the chapel, where broken icons stared down at them with hollow eyes. His voice, steady and calm, carried conviction like a blade honed sharp. Do not listen to whispers born of corruption. You know their stench. You know their chains. We are Raven Guard. We are phantoms, not because we are forgotten, but because we endure. Our silence is our defiance. The Imperium may abandon us, but we do not abandon ourselves. Shadows are not weakness. Shadows survive, and in survival, they preserve meaning. To surrender to the warp is not eternity. It is erasure. His words soothed some, ignited faith in others, but for many, they deepened the conflict within. The commander knew both gatherings, though neither called him. He knew Kaedor's fire and Loran's faith, and he knew that each pulled the phantoms apart, stretching the vigil to its breaking point. He stood in the strategium alone, the star map flickering before him, its light casting his reflection in shards. He pressed his gauntlet to the console, and he wondered whether any of this mattered. The galaxy had forgotten them. The Imperium did not call for them. The prophecy was fractured, spoken in whispers from a broken machine. And yet here they stood, tearing themselves apart for words etched in stone, for voices carried by static. His silence, once strength, now felt like cowardice. He did not need to wait long for the fracture to manifest. The alarm tore through the ship, sharp and sudden, not from outside, but within. Blades rang in the corridors. Bolters spat fire. Voices broke the oath of silence in cries of rage. The vigil had shattered. Brother fought brother. Shadows tearing at shadows. Kaedor's followers struck first, their blades crimson, their movements wild but purposeful. They roared their defiance, silence abandoned, voices filled with fury as they fought not orcs, not aliens, but their own kin. Loran's faithful met them with grim resolve, their silence unbroken, even as their blades carved through corrupted brothers. The corridors became rivers of blood, the air choked with smoke and screams. The commander moved through the chaos, his blade flashing, his presence commanding. Yet even he could not quell the storm. Warriors he had fought beside for centuries now turned on one another, their oaths shattered, their faith splintered. The prophecy had come true, though not as salvation, but as damnation. The phantoms had not been remembered to rise, they had been remembered to fall. He found Kaedor in the armory, his blade dripping, his eyes alight with fevered fire. The commander's voice, low, cut through the noise. "You have broken us." Kaedor's laugh was harsh, triumphant. "No, Commander, I have freed us. You cling to silence as if it saves us. But silence has killed us. The warp offers more. It speaks to me. It shows me the truth. We are not phantoms. We are not forgotten. We are eternal if we dare to take it." Loran burst into the chamber then, his armor cracked, his face bloodied, his blade steady despite the weight of grief in his eyes. He stared at Kaedor as though seeing not a brother, but a shadow twisted into something unrecognizable. "You are no Raven Guard. You are no brother. You are nothing but corruption in black armor." The three stood in the armory, the air heavy with smoke and blood, the silence torn apart by the echoes of betrayal. The commander looked between them, his silence crushing him, his choice looming. For centuries he had endured, bound by silence, but silence no longer endured. It suffocated, it demanded. Kaedor's blade rose, his voice a snarl. "Choose, Commander. Stand with me and embrace eternity, or cling to shadows until they consume you. But choose, for the vigil is dead." Loran raised his blade, his voice calm, resolute. "Stand with me, Commander. Stand with what we were, with what we swore, even if it means death. Shadows endure not because they are strong, but because they refuse to vanish." The commander's hands tightened on his weapon. His silence roared in his ears, louder than any battle, louder than the screams echoing through the ship. He had carried them this far, bound them together in silence, endured centuries of exile. But now that silence demanded its end, he knew whichever path he chose, the vigil would never be the same. The armory trembled as explosions rocked the ship, the civil war consuming its halls. Brothers died unseen, their blood soaking the black decks. The prophecy's words echoed in his mind, fractured and cruel. The raven still watches. The hour is near. Shadows must rise. But what did it mean to rise? To endure? To damn? Kador's eyes blazed, Loran's eyes burned, and the commander stood between them, torn apart by the weight of choice. His silence could no longer bind them. His silence could no longer endure. As he raised his blade, the ship groaned, the void outside pressing in, and the Vigil itself seemed to tremble, waiting for the moment that would decide whether shadows endured or whether they collapsed into the warp's eternal hunger. The corridors of the Nocturne's Vigil burned with the fire of betrayal. Bolter shells screamed through the dark, chains wards tore against ceramite, and the silence that had once bound them had dissolved into the chaos of brothers turned enemies. Shadows clashed with shadows, the black of their armor indistinguishable, until the moment of death revealed allegiance by action alone. Smoke filled the decks, thick with the copper tang of blood, while the ship groaned as if it too mourned the shattering of its vigil. The commander moved through it all with grim inevitability, his blade flashing in the flickering light. Each strike cut down not strangers, not orcs, not Xenos, but those who had once stood at his side, men who had endured centuries of exile under his command. He did not scream, he did not curse. His silence was his weapon, a void that swallowed the noise of civil war, but it could not stop the fracture tearing through his kin. With each brother that fell, his heart hollowed further, yet he pressed on, for choice no longer waited. Kador led his chosen through the lower decks, their voices rising in bitter cries as they fought with reckless fury, their silence abandoned like a discarded oath. His laughter echoed through the vox, jagged and raw, his words a mockery of vows. No more shadows, no more silence. We will not endure, we will ascend. His followers roared in answer, their blades dripping with the blood of kin. They fought with desperation and hunger, as though the warp itself drove their hands. Loran led his faithful through the upper halls, their silence unbroken even in battle. They fought with precision, each strike a measured echo of their oaths, their voices raised only in the rhythm of bolter fire. Yet behind their silence burned grief, a grief so sharp it cut deeper than any blade. Loran's eyes shone with conviction, even as blood streaked his armor, his every strike a denial of Kador's corruption, his every movement a prayer unspoken. The commander found himself drawn to the heart of the ship, where the strategium's glow painted the walls in dying light. The star map flickered, broken by fire and stray bolts, its constellations dissolving into chaos. It was here the two sides converged, shadows colliding in a storm of steel and fury. The air was thick with smoke, the floor slick with blood, the silence shattered by the clash of brother against brother. Kador strode into the chamber first, his blade crimson, his eyes wild. "It ends here, Commander," he snarled, his voice a growl that carried over the din. "You will not cling to silence any longer. Choose me, and we take eternity. Choose him, and you die with dust in your throat." Loran entered moments later, his armor scarred, his blade raised, his breath ragged yet steady. He looked to the commander, his voice calm, resolute, even in despair. "We endure, Commander. We endure because we must. Shadows do not vanish. They remain even when the light dies. If you choose Kador, then all we were, all we bled for, all who died at Istvan, it will be for nothing." The commander stood between them, the glow of the star map reflecting across his armor, his silence crushing the chamber as heavily as the smoke. The battle raged around them, their brothers cutting each other down, blood painting the walls. But here, in the heart of the ship, The Vigil's fate trembled on the edge of his choice. Kador raised his blade, pointing it toward him. You know the truth. The warp calls because it knows us. We are forgotten by the Imperium, abandoned by Korax, forsaken by the Emperor himself. But the warp does not forget. It promises what silence cannot. You feel it, Commander. I see it in your eyes. Do not lie to yourself. Loran's voice, softer, steadier, cut against Kador's fury. The warp offers only chains, Commander. Chains forged in lies. Shadows are not chains. Shadows are freedom because they endure when nothing else can. We are forgotten, yes, but we are not gone. If we fall now, let us fall as Raven Guard, not as something twisted into what we were never meant to be. The commander closed his eyes for a moment, and in the darkness he heard the whispers. Voices of the dead, names etched into stone, brothers who had fallen on Istvan. Their laughter, their vows, their pain, all carried into him as though the warp itself pressed them into his mind. We endured so you would choose. The words struck like a blade. He had delayed for centuries, held them together with silence, but now that silence was breaking. He opened his eyes, his blade rising, his step slow but certain. Kador's gaze sharpened, hunger alight. Loran's gaze steadied, hope glimmering in despair. The commander moved forward, and the chamber seemed to still, as if the ship itself held its breath. Then he struck, not at Kador, not at Loran, but at those around them. His blade carved through Kador's followers, his silence roaring louder than any voice. He cut them down with merciless precision, his fury not directed at belief or doubt, but at betrayal itself. He became a storm of shadow and steel, his silence a scream that none could mistake. Kador roared, his fury twisting into disbelief. You strike them, but not me. Do you think this will save you? Do you think you can kill doubt with silence? He charged, his blade arcing, and the commander met him, their clash shaking the strategium, sparks spilling like dying stars. Loran joined the fray, his blade cutting down Kador's nearest, his movements sharp and measured, his silence carrying the weight of faith. Together, he and the commander fought Kador, their blades flashing, their bodies colliding with his fury. Kador roared like a beast, his strikes wild, his strength fueled by something darker than rage. Every blow echoed the warp's hunger, every strike carried the weight of corruption. The duel tore the chamber apart, consoles shattering, flames rising, blood pooling at their feet. The commander fought with grim inevitability, his silence absolute, his blade unyielding. Loran fought with purpose, his every strike a vow. Kador fought with desperation and fury, his laughter twisted, his voice echoing like madness. At last, the commander drove his blade into Kador's side, the steel biting deep, blood spraying across the deck. Kador roared, staggering, his eyes burning with hatred and hunger. This is not the end, he spat, his voice a snarl through blood. I will not fall as a shadow. I will rise, even if it damns me. With a final cry, he struck the console beside him, sparks erupting, fire spilling across the chamber. The star map dissolved into static, the ship shuddering as systems screamed. Kador fled into the smoke, his laughter echoing, his followers dragging him away into the chaos. The commander stood amid the ruin, his blade dripping, his silence heavier than ever. Loran placed a hand on his shoulder, blood seeping from his wounds, his voice quiet. The choice is not over. He lives, and as long as he does, the Vigil trembles. The commander looked into the smoke where Kador had vanished, and for the first time in centuries, he spoke aloud, his voice hollow, final. Then the Vigil will bleed, until one of us is gone. The ship groaned, its halls still filled with battle, its silence broken forever. The prophecy whispered once more in his mind, cruel and fractured. The raven still watches. The hour is near. Shadows must rise. He did not know whether those words meant salvation or damnation. He only knew the vigil was no longer whole, and that choice had torn it apart. The Nocturne's vigil drifted wounded through the void, its hull scarred by fire from within more than by any enemy without. Smoke bled from its vents, and its lights flickered in uneven pulses, like the heartbeat of a dying beast. The silence that once defined the phantoms was now a silence of aftermath, of exhaustion and dread, broken only by the groans of steel and the occasional scream echoing faintly through the decks, where the loyal and the lost still clashed in pockets of bloodshed. The commander walked the blackened corridors, his boots splashing through pools of oil and blood alike. He passed the corpses of brothers, their armor indistinguishable save for the positions in which they had fallen, some with blades locked together, others riddled with bolter rounds. There was no line dividing loyalist from traitor here. They were all phantoms once, all shadows once. Now they were fragments, remnants, each death a piece of the vigil broken beyond repair. He reached the strategium again, now a ruin of shattered consoles and blackened walls. The star map was dead, static hissing across what remained of its surface. The chamber still smelled of fire and blood, and the echoes of Kador's laughter seemed trapped in its corners. The commander stood at its heart, blade in hand, his reflection fractured in the shattered glass. He closed his eyes, but the silence within him was no longer the silence of endurance. It was the silence of mourning, of a vigil bleeding out before his eyes. Elsewhere, Kador gathered his followers. Their numbers thinned, but their fervor sharpened. His wound was bound in crude plates, his armor cracked, his face pale yet burning with fevered conviction. He spoke to them not as a commander but as a prophet, his voice ragged but carrying the force of belief. Do you see? Do you feel it? The commander cannot choose because he is already dead inside. His silence is his grave. But we... He struck his chest with a gauntleted fist, blood staining his hand. We are alive. The warp has spoken to us. It has called to us. And it will not abandon us as Korax abandoned us. We are more than phantoms. We are the storm in the shadows. His followers bowed their heads, some murmuring broken vows, others raising their blades as if swearing themselves to him anew. Loran, too, gathered his wounded, the faithful who still clung to the vow carved into stone and memory. They knelt in the ruined chapel, broken icons scattered around them, light from failing lumen strips falling across their scarred faces. Loran's voice was low, steady, filled not with fire, but with quiet conviction. We are not forgotten, brothers. We endure, because endurance itself is our defiance. The warp tempts, Kador tempts, but they are the same. Shadows endure, not because they are unbroken, but because they refuse to vanish. Even if the galaxy never remembers us, even if Korax never returns, we remember who we are. That is enough. His words held them, if only barely, their silence trembling but unbroken. The commander knew both voices, though he sought neither gathering. He walked the decks alone, his silence heavy, his mind torn. He thought of Istvan, of the massacre that had marked their souls forever. He remembered the faces of brothers laughing before the drop, the fire that consumed them, the betrayal that scarred them. He had carried their memory for centuries, binding the phantoms with silence, holding them together by sheer endurance. But now that silence was shattered, Kador had torn it open. Loran had tried to mend it, and he himself stood between them, hollow, bound, unable to close the wound. The ship groaned, systems failing, the void pressing in. Fires burned unchecked in some decks, and still the fighting flickered in pockets, traitors and loyalists clashing in the dark. It was no longer war. It was butchery, brothers tearing at each other for meanings they no longer understood. The commander felt the prophecy's weight pressing on him like iron chains. The raven still watches. The hour is near. Shadows must rise. But rise to what? Salvation? Damnation? Was prophecy truth? Or was it merely another whisper from the warp, laughing at their suffering? He entered the armory once more, the place where Kador and Loran had confronted him, the place where the Vigil had cracked. Weapons lay scattered, some broken, some blood-stained. He knelt before them, placing his blade across his knees. For the first time in centuries, he spoke aloud, not to his brothers, not to Kador or Loran, but to the dead. I have endured. I have carried you in silence, but now silence fails me. I do not know what choice remains. His words echoed in the chamber, hollow, desperate, swallowed by smoke and flame. As if in answer, the warp stirred. The walls trembled, the lights flickered, and a whisper slid into his mind, sweeter than venom. You need not endure alone. Choose eternity. Choose power. Choose to be remembered. He clenched his fists, teeth grinding, but the voice would not fade. It was Kador's voice, and yet not Kador's. A voice older, crueler, wearing his brother's hunger like a mask. He rose, his blade in hand, his silence hardening once more. If choice had been delayed, it could be delayed no longer. He returned to the strategium, calling both sides to him with a command that cut through the vox. His voice, though seldom used, carried the weight of centuries. It demanded, and it was obeyed. Loran came with his faithful, bloodied but resolute, their eyes burning with silent vows. Kador came with his fractured following, their silence broken into snarls, their eyes gleaming with hunger for something more. They faced each other across the shattered chamber, weapons ready, hatred simmering, the fracture laid bare. The commander stood between them, his blade raised, his voice low but carrying like thunder. Enough. The word rang across the chamber, silencing even Kador's snarls. He looked to one side, then the other, his eyes hollow yet unflinching. We are not orcs. We are not Xenos. We are Raven Guard. Yet here we stand, killing each other like carrion beasts. Kador would have you embrace the warp. Loran would have you cling to vows carved in dust. And I, he paused, his silence pressing heavy, I would have you endure. Not for prophecy, not for Korax, not for the Emperor, for us. For what we were, for what we still are, even broken. Kador spat blood, his voice sharp. Empty words, Commander. Endurance is death by another name. I will not kneel to it. Loran's silence spoke louder than any reply, his eyes fixed on the commander, waiting, believing. The commander's blade lowered. He knew the time for silence had ended. Choice loomed, vast and inevitable, heavier than any war. He would make it not tomorrow, not in centuries, but now. The ship trembled, the void pressing in, the whispers of the warp rising, laughter and prophecy colliding in the smoke. Kador's eyes burned. Loran's eyes shone. The commander's silence broke once more, his voice hollow yet final. The Vigil cannot endure both. One path must fall. The chamber erupted as brothers raised their blades, the fracture now a chasm, the choice drawn in blood. The commander stepped forward, blade ready, his silence shattered forever. his decision written not in words but in steel. The Nocturne's vigil shook as though the galaxy itself bore witness. The prophecy whispered once more, cruel and unyielding, shadows must rise. And in that moment, shadows rose, not united, not whole, but as a legion at war with itself, its fate sealed in fire and blood. The ship became a graveyard as the battle consumed its bones. Corridors that had once echoed with the quiet tread of disciplined shadows now thundered with the roar of bolters and the clash of blades. Fire licked along the ceilings, thick smoke choking the air, and the Nocturne's vigil groaned beneath the strain, as though it wished to cast its warriors into the void, to silence them forever. Shadows fought shadows in a frenzy of hate, their black armor indistinguishable until death revealed them by the oaths they kept or the madness they embraced. The commander carved a path through the chaos, his silence unbroken, his blade a metronome of inevitability. He did not fight for Kaidor, nor for Loran, but for the remnants of the vigil itself, the shards of meaning still buried in the ashes. Every strike of his blade was precise, every movement honed by centuries of endurance. Brothers fell before him, some with curses, others with prayers, but all with the same hollow eyes that haunted him with every death. His silence devoured them, but it could not ease the weight pressing into his chest. Kaidor fought like a storm loosed from chains, his laughter echoing down the corridors, jagged and cruel. His blade howled as it cut through the loyal, his followers howling with him, their silence long since shattered into frenzy. He had abandoned all restraint, all memory of oaths once spoken beneath Corax's gaze. The warp whispered through him now, its tendrils tightening around his heart, each strike carrying its venom deeper into his soul. His eyes glowed faintly in the firelight, as though something unseen moved behind them. Loran fought with the precision of faith, his silence unbroken even as he waded through carnage. His blade carved arcs of fire and steel, his bolter barked when needed, and his presence steadied those who still clung to vows. He did not speak, for words were no longer necessary. His silence itself was defiance, and his men mirrored him, their movements sharp, their faces grim. Together, they moved like fragments of the old legion, shadows that refused to vanish. Yet even he knew the cost. For every brother that fell at his side left the silence thinner, weaker, stretched across too many graves. The commander found them at last in the shattered hangar, where flames danced across the wreckage of broken craft. Kaidor stood at the far side. His followers gathered, their armor cracked, their blades dripping. Loran stood near the center, his remaining faithful arrayed around him in silence, their eyes fixed upon their corrupted kin. Between them lay the bodies of those who had fallen in the clash. Dozens sprawled in death, their black armor smeared with the same blood that had once sworn the same oath. The hangar was no longer a place of preparation, but a tomb waiting to close. The commander stepped forward, his blade lowered but ready, his presence dragging every eye toward him. The silence thickened, broken only by the distant groan of the ship and the crackle of fire. He looked at Kaidor first, and in those fever-bright eyes he saw the hunger of a soul already lost, tethered not by loyalty but by the promise of power. Then he looked at Loran, whose silence burned with conviction, yet whose eyes carried sorrow too deep to mask. Kaidor broke the quiet, his voice sharp, triumphant. "You see it, Commander. You cannot deny it. The Vigil is already dead. What remains is what we choose to take. Stand with me, and we rise eternal. Stand against me, and you fall with him into dust." His blade rose, its crimson reflection dancing in the firelight, his followers shifting behind him with eager snarls. Loran's silence was his reply. He simply raised his blade, its steel steady, its vow unbroken. His eyes met the commander's, and though his lips did not move, the message was clear. Choose. Not for prophecy, not for memory, but for us. The commander raised his weapon slowly, his silence heavier than any words he could speak. For a heartbeat, time itself seemed to freeze, the flames pausing in their dance, the ship holding its breath. Then Kador roared and charged, his blade swinging in a storm of fury, his followers surging with him. Lauren met them with equal resolve, his silence crashing like a wall against the tide. The hangar erupted in chaos, the Vigil's last remnants tearing themselves apart in final defiance. The commander fought at the heart of it, his blade clashing against Kador's again and again. Sparks showered from their strikes, their movements a dance of rage and inevitability. Kador's laughter echoed with madness, his every strike wild yet fueled by strength not his own. The commander's silence held steady, his every parry measured, his counterstrikes carving deeper into Kador's fury. Around them, loyalists and traitors died in heaps, the hangar floor slick with blood, the air thick with smoke and screams. Lauren fought nearby, his blade carving arcs through Kador's men, his silence unbroken even as wounds opened across his flesh. His faithful fell one by one, their silence buying him space, their deaths heavy in his eyes, yet not enough to break him. He pressed forward, his presence steady, his conviction unyielding. He caught glimpses of the commander and Kador, locked in their storm, and he knew the Vigil's fate balanced there, in the clash of silence and fury. The commander pressed harder, his blade cutting into Kador's side, drawing a roar of rage. Kador struck back, his blade grazing across the commander's helm, sparks blinding him for a heartbeat. Their duel tore through the hangar, steel against steel, silence against laughter. At last, with a surge of strength born not of hunger, but of inevitability, the commander drove Kador back, their blades locking, their eyes burning into one another. "You cannot endure," Kador spat, blood dripping from his lips. "Silence is death. You are already nothing." The commander's silence was his reply. He pressed forward, their blades trembling, sparks raining down, until at last his strike broke through. His blade sank into Kador's chest, cutting deep, driving through armor and flesh. Kador roared, blood spraying, his laughter breaking into a ragged scream. He staggered, his blade falling from his grip, his eyes wide with disbelief and fury. Loran reached him then, his own blade flashing, and together they struck. Kador's body crumpled, his laughter fading, into silence at last, his blood pooling across the deck. His followers, seeing their prophet fall, screamed in despair, their frenzy shattering. Some fought on in madness, others fled into the shadows of the burning ship. The commander stood over Kador's body, his blade dripping, his silence heavier than ever. Around him, the hangar lay in ruin, brothers dead in heaps, fire licking along the walls. Loran stood at his side, bloodied, his silence trembling but unbroken. Their eyes met, and in that look was no triumph, no victory, only grief and the knowledge that the Vigil was now nothing more than fragments scattered across a graveyard of shadows. The ship groaned, its hull failing, the void pressing in. The prophecy whispered once more in the commander's mind, cruel and mocking. The raven still watches. Shadows must rise. He looked at the corpses of his brothers, at Kador's broken body, at Loran's weary gaze, and he knew the Vigil had risen only to fall into silence once more. He turned from the dead, his steps heavy, his silence endless. The Vigil endured still, but it endured as ghosts, shadows clinging to a galaxy that no longer remembered them. And in that silence, he wondered whether endurance itself was the cruelest lie of all. The hangar smouldered like a wound that would never close. Smoke curled upward into the broken rafters, drifting lazily into the void through rents in the hull, where the stars glimmered cold and indifferent. The bodies of brothers lay strewn across the deck, armor cracked, blades still clenched in lifeless hands. Some stared blankly with hollow eyes. Others collapsed face down in their own blood, all of them indistinguishable in the black of their armor. Only their silence told the truth, that the Vigil, once bound by unity, had torn itself apart and bled to death on its own altar. The commander stood amid the ruin, his blade hanging limp at his side, streaked red and black. Kador's corpse lay nearby, twisted, broken, his once burning eyes glazed over into emptiness. The fever of his madness had guttered out, leaving only a husk in the firelight. Yet even in death he seemed to sneer, as if mocking the silence that had triumphed over him. The commander looked down at him, and for the first time in centuries, he felt no strength in endurance, only exhaustion and a question that gnawed like a wound. Had Kador been wrong, or had he been right in ways more terrible than he could admit? Loran moved to his side, his armor cracked, his face bloodied, but his posture unbroken. He gazed at the ruin with quiet grief, his silence as steady as it had always been. Around him, the remnants of his faithful gathered, fewer now than even shadows could conceal. Their eyes met their commander's, not with the fire of hope, but with the hollow weight of survival. They waited for him to speak, to lead, but he could not. His silence, once a command that bound them, now felt like a tomb. The ship trembled again, its wounded hull groaning under the strain. Fires raged unchecked, compartments sealed off or vented to the void, systems flickering one by one into failure. The Nocturne's Vigil had endured centuries of exile, but it could not endure the war waged inside it. The commander knew its death was near, as inevitable as the death of the Vigil itself. He turned away from Kador's corpse and looked to the surviving brothers, each scarred, each broken, each waiting for a direction that no longer existed. "Secure the wounded," Loran said at last, his voice breaking the silence like a quiet prayer. The others obeyed, dragging broken bodies to the side, offering what little aid they could. There were no chants, no blessings, no rites, only the grim work of survival. The commander watched, unmoving, his silence pressing on him until he felt he might drown in it. He left the hangar and wandered through the corridors of his dying ship. The walls were blackened with soot, streaked with blood. Icons once revered by his brothers lay shattered on the floor, trampled in the frenzy of civil war. He passed the chapel, its altars broken, its symbols torn down, the silence within it not sacred but hollow. He passed the armory, weapons scattered, bolters lying beside their fallen owners, blades dulled and caked with gore. Every corner spoke of ruin, of endurance spent at last. He stopped before the viewport at the prow, where the stars stretched endless, cold, and far. He pressed his hand against the glass, his reflection staring back, hollow-eyed, scarred, drenched in blood. He saw not a commander, not a guardian of shadows, but a relic bound to silence that no longer held meaning. Behind him, he heard the faint tread of Loran's boots. "You saved us," Loran said, his voice steady, though grief clung to it. The commander did not turn. "I ended us." Loran was silent for a moment, then stepped forward, standing at his side. His gaze followed the stars, distant and indifferent. "Perhaps both are true. Kador would have damned us all. You stopped him. That is enough." The commander's silence lingered, his thoughts drifting to Istvan, to the betrayal that had scarred them, to the centuries of exile, to the prophecy whispered in static. The raven still watches. Shadows must rise. He wondered if this was what rising meant. Not victory, not redemption, but tearing themselves apart until nothing remained but fragments scattered across the void. Perhaps prophecy had never promised salvation. Perhaps it had only promised the inevitability of their fall. The ship shuddered violently, alarms wailing as more systems failed. Loran looked back toward the ruins of the Strategium, then to the commander. The Nocturne's vigil will not last. If we remain, we die with it. We must take what remains and flee. The commander's eyes stayed fixed on the stars. Flee to what? The Imperium has forgotten us. Korax has abandoned us. The galaxy holds no place for shadows. Then we endure anyway, Loran replied. His voice sharpened, not with hope, but with defiance. That is what we are. Not because it is glorious, not because it saves us, but because it is what we were made to do. The words struck deep, though the commander said nothing. His silence was no longer command, no longer shield, but a reflection of the hollow truth within him. Still, he followed when Loran led the survivors to the docking bays, their numbers so few they barely filled a single craft. They left behind the Nocturne's vigil, its carcass aflame, drifting toward the cold embrace of the void. From the viewport of the small vessel, they watched as it broke apart, decks crumbling, flames spilling into the black. The ship that had carried their vigil for centuries was gone, swallowed by silence. The commander closed his eyes, listening not to the ship's death, but to the voices that still haunted him. The laughter of Kaidor, the steady faith of Loran, the whispers of prophecy. The ghosts of Istvan, they circled him like vultures, each demanding, each accusing. His silence held them at bay, but only barely. He wondered how much longer even silence could endure. The survivors drifted through the void, a handful of shadows clinging to the wreckage of their existence. No world awaited them, no allies. Only the endless stars and the whispers of the warp. They moved in silence, each carrying wounds deeper than flesh, each bound to a vigil that no longer had meaning. Yet still they lived, and living was itself endurance. The commander sat at the helm, his reflection staring back at him in the glass once more. He saw not a leader, not even a survivor, but a phantom among phantoms. He thought of the vow carved into stone so long ago. We are shadows, and shadows endure. It had been their anchor, their prison, their identity. Now it was all they had left, though even it felt hollow. The stars drifted on, indifferent to their suffering, to their endurance, to their silence. The galaxy did not remember them, and perhaps it never would. Yet still they moved, broken, bloodied, fractured, but alive. Perhaps that was enough. Perhaps not. The commander closed his eyes, and in the darkness, the prophecy whispered one final time. The raven still watches. The hour is near. Shadows must rise. He did not know what it meant, or if it meant anything at all. But he endured, and in enduring, he remained. For now, the stars passed slowly beyond the fractured viewing canopy of the stolen vessel, each one like an old wound, barely scabbed over, too distant to heal, too ancient to matter. The survivors of the phantoms, those who had not bowed to Kador's madness or fallen to the fire of Brother's blade, drifted in silence through the void. The craft was small, a mining hauler long since repurposed, its engines stripped down, its walls scorched and welded with patchwork iron. It was never meant to carry the weight of a dying legion. Loran moved, among the wounded, the broken, the few who remained. He offered no comfort. There was none to give, but his presence was stillness, a center of gravity for those whose orbits had all collapsed. He checked wounds, muttered the litanies more out of memory than hope, and bound what he could. When he passed the commander, he did not speak. They had not exchanged words since abandoning the Nocturne's vigil. Nothing remained to say. The commander sat beneath a flickering lumen panel, his armor scuffed, the aquila on his chest plate scorched away during the final battle. His hands were clasped loosely before him, blood dried beneath his nails, eyes fixed on a distant point beyond the steel walls, as if watching something only he could see. The silence he had once used to hold them together now seemed to hold only himself, a cage more than a choice. No one questioned him. None dared. There were 14 of them left. Once they had numbered hundreds, a fragment of the Raven Guard scattered by betrayal, hardened in exile, tempered by silence. Now they were barely a squad, barely a breath, a name whispered too long, worn down to air. They had fled the fire, yes, but what they had fled into was worse. Emptiness without anchor, purpose without shape. There were no coordinates, no mission, no vox signal from the wider Imperium. Only Loran's quiet resolve and the commander's silent burden. The ship passed a dead world, a hollow sphere broken by orbital bombardment in a war centuries past. Its surface was cracked open like bones split by hammer, cities reduced to ash rings circling the equator. The engines hummed low, drifting them closer, not for salvation, but for something else. Fuel, perhaps, or simply a place to fall down and rest. Loran stood behind the pilot's seat, eyes narrowed as the ruins grew larger in the glass. "We descend," he said at last. "Whether for supplies or meaning, I do not know. But we cannot drift forever." No one argued. Silence had returned, not as unity, but as exhaustion. They made landfall on the second night cycle, dust clouds rolling across the fractured plain. The air was thin, almost breathable, and the cold bit into their armor like memory. They disembarked in staggered silence, boots crunching on soil long dead. The ruins loomed around them, once imperial, once proud. Now only foundations remained, scorched and sunken, twisted by fire and time. The commander walked ahead without word or gesture, his silhouette etched in the pale light of the dead sky. The others followed at a respectful distance, not out of reverence, but because no one could bear to walk beside him. He wandered between broken pillars, past shattered shrines, stepping over bones too old to mourn. Some still clutched rusted weapons. Others were bound in chains. The past had died here violently, and now its echo received them like an old companion. In the shadow of a collapsed chapel, he stopped. A mural, half preserved, clung to the broken stone. It depicted the Emperor, not as God, but as Lord of Man, stern-eyed and radiant, his hand outstretched to lead a procession of nameless warriors into the stars. The lower half of the mural had been burned away, blackened into unreadable ruin. The commander reached out, fingers brushing the edge of the flame-scarred stone. Ash crumbled beneath his touch. His voice came softly then, the first in days. "Do you think he ever knew our names?" Loran approached, standing beside him. He did not look at the mural. "I don't know if that matters anymore." The commander's hand fell. "Then why are we still alive?" Loran didn't answer, not immediately. He bent and picked up a rusted chain blade from the earth, its teeth locked by age, its hilt wrapped in the remains of a dead man's hand. He set it upright in the dust, like a marker stone, and looked to the commander at last. "Because we haven't chosen to die." The words rang true, not in hope, but in fact. The commander turned from the mural and looked over the broken city, at the others gathering near a ruined colonnade. They were setting up nothing permanent. There was nothing permanent left in them. But it was an action. A campfire sparked to life with scraps of flamer fuel and igniters. He walked among them slowly, his silence still his mantle, but not his shield. A child once might have asked what he was thinking, what future he saw in the stars. Now, no one asked. They did not need to. The fire cracked softly, casting flickering shadows on their armor. Loran stood across the flames, his features drawn, his expression unreadable. The commander sat, unspeaking, and for a long time, they simply watched the light. One of the others began to clean a bolter, slow and methodical, though there was no battle to come. Another carved a mark into the stone with a combat knife. The old raven's sigil, reduced now to a memory scratched into a wall. The stars above wheeled in silence. No prophecy spoke. No warp voice whispered. No divine sign appeared in the sky. And yet something stirred. Not power, not salvation, but the faintest sense of motion. That they were not entirely done. That perhaps endurance, bitter and bare, was its own form of vengeance. The commander looked around the fire, his voice low. "We are few." Loran nodded once. "We were always few." "We carry their names," the commander said, as if speaking it aloud gave it weight. "The dead, the lost, the ones who followed Kador, the ones who followed us. They are still with us." "And we carry them," Loran replied, quiet. "Not for the Imperium, not for Korax, but because someone has to." The commander's silence deepened, but it no longer felt like suffocation. The fire cracked once more, throwing their shadows long across the ruin. The ravens still watched, perhaps. Or perhaps the raven had never watched at all. But either way, the shadows remained. Not because they were chosen, not because they were worthy, but because they refused to be erased. And somewhere in the dust and silence, the vigil endured. Dawn broke without warmth. The dead world's star, pale and distant, spilled cold light across the ruined horizon, illuminating nothing but broken stone and the flickering shapes of men too tired to stand and too disciplined to rest. The fire from the night before had died to embers, casting only faint warmth across cracked armor and shuttered eyes. The wind stirred through the empty bones of the city, carrying ash and silence like prayer. The commander stood alone on the ridge above the camp, his armor washed in the faint gold of the rising sun, though it did nothing to ease the weight pressing on his chest. The light touched his features and found only stone. He had not slept. He had barely moved since the night before, as though afraid motion might scatter what remained of his thoughts. Below him, the survivors shifted slowly, their movements heavy. They no longer spoke, not from tradition, but because language had little meaning left to offer. What could be said that the blood had not already answered? He turned his gaze outward, across the shattered plains, where the ruins of once proud structures lay half buried in dust. This place had fallen long before they arrived. He wondered if its warriors had stood in these same places, looking at the same broken sky, asking the same questions. He wondered if, when the end came for them, they had held to their oaths or cast them aside. He wondered which fate would claim his brothers now. Behind him, Loran approached, his steps slow, deliberate. The light caught the fresh scarring across his cheek, a mark left by one of Kador's zealots in the final clash aboard the Nocturne's Vigil. He had not had it treated. Whether by intention or necessity, it had become part of him, just as the sorrow in his eyes had deepened, carved into him like a second gene seed. He did not greet the commander. He simply stood beside him, letting the silence settle between them as naturally as breath. "They're asking if we'll move again," Loran said at last, his voice quieter than the wind. The commander did not respond immediately. His eyes tracked a distant bird, black and slow, gliding between the towers of wreckage. It vanished behind stone and did not return. "There's nowhere to go," he said. "Maybe not," Loran replied. "But if we stay, we become ghosts. Not shadows. Ghosts." The commander closed his eyes. The words stung, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. He had thought survival would be enough, that enduring meant victory of a sort. But here, on this nameless world, with the blood of brothers still drying beneath his boots, he understood that endurance without purpose was simply waiting for extinction. Loran turned his head slightly. "We found a signal relay, dead mostly, but one channel still pings. Automated, old Imperial code." Imperial? Fragmented. Might be an outpost, could be a trap, could be nothing. The commander breathed in slowly, letting the cold air fill his lungs. For a moment, he imagined following it, rallying what was left, boarding the craft again, chasing a ghost of a signal through the stars. And then what? They were not a legion. They were not even a chapter. They were broken blades, barely holding edge. "They want you to lead again," Loran said. "Even now. They want someone who still believes." "Belief isn't what holds us," Loran said, his voice low. "Oaths aren't held by gods or ghosts. They're held by the ones too stubborn to let go." The commander turned to look at him, and in that moment, he saw not the idealist Loran had once been, but a survivor who had buried more than his share of brothers. There was no shine left in his eyes, only resolve. "Then we leave tomorrow," the commander said. He descended the ridge, walking among the men, if they could still be called that. Armor dented, helmets held together by scrap welds, weapons pieced back into shape with memory and scavenged parts. They looked at him without salute, but with something deeper. Expectation. Will. Not loyalty to a name, not belief in a cause, but trust that he would keep moving, even as everything around them crumbled. He gave them the signal. No speech, no rallying cry, just a nod, a gesture toward the wrecked ship, and the old ritual began. Blades were sharpened, packs sealed. A few looked to the sky as if expecting the Emperor himself to descend from the clouds. None of them spoke. They were past words. That night, sleep did not come. The fire was smaller. No one gathered around it. The commander sat alone again, this time at the base of a toppled statue. He looked up at the stars through the gap in the broken stone, seeing them as he had seen them for centuries, distant, unfeeling. But now he saw something else too, space enough to move. The air shifted. Footsteps. He didn't look. He knew who it was. Loran sat beside him, setting a small object between them. A piece of cracked glass, part of a visor maybe, etched with the sigil of the Raven Guard. It had been scraped clean and recarved. The lines were uneven, crude, but the shape remained. "I found it in the chapel on the Vigil," Loran said. "Didn't mean to take it. Just couldn't leave it there." The commander picked it up, turned it in his fingers. The light of the fire shimmered through it, bending the raven's wings into a strange arc. "You think the raven still watches?" "I don't know," Loran answered, "but I think we're still watching, and maybe that's enough." The commander said nothing. He tucked the shard into his vambrace and stood. The signal waited, and whatever it was, lie, trap, salvation, it was more than ashes. At dawn, they left the ruined city, 14 shadows walking into the light. The ship groaned as it lifted, its engines flaring, against gravity that wanted to hold them down. No one looked back. The dead knew their names. That was enough. In the silence of the stars, the commander watched the world shrink behind them, the scars of their exile fading into blue-grey haze. Ahead, only darkness and the faint pulse of an old signal. It was not purpose. It was not prophecy, but it was movement. And the Vigil, though broken, moved with him. The stars moved slowly past the view screen, distant and indifferent, their ancient light painting thin lines across the reinforced glass, like memories stretched too far to hold. The Vigil groaned beneath its own weight, her hull cracked in places that could never be repaired, her bones groaning with each course correction. She had been a warship once. Now she was little more than a drifting tomb, kept alive by the sheer force of stubbornness that echoed from her bridge to her engines. The commander stood near the helm, one hand resting lightly on the control console, not touching anything, just steadying himself against the vastness outside. The signal still pulsed, weak but constant, like a heartbeat that refused to die. Loran's voice rose from below deck through the Vox link, tinny with interference. We've scrubbed the outer coils, but they won't hold atmospheric re-entry, if it comes to that. The commander answered after a pause. It won't. But even as he said it, he wasn't sure. The signal drew them toward a dying star system, a forgotten cluster where imperial records turned to silence. What they would find there, if anything, remained unwritten. And yet they came, because motion, at least, gave the illusion of purpose. The remaining brothers moved through the ship like ghosts in armor, pausing sometimes in front of doorways that no longer opened, or halls that led to the graves of those they could not bury. No one spoke. They had not spoken freely since the fall. They no longer needed to. Their silence had matured into a language of glances, nods, shared breath. Even sorrow no longer pressed between them. It had settled into the armor. Kador's name had not been spoken since the confrontation. The firelight had burned it away. His betrayal had bled its color into their memory and vanished. He had not become a warning. He had simply become part of the loss, like too many others. A soft chime echoed through the bridge. The commander looked up. Loran entered, face pale with exhaustion, but eyes still sharp. We're close. How close? 1 hour, maybe less. Signals stronger. It's not just automated pulses anymore. The commander turned toward him fully. Explain. Loran keyed the secondary console and played a short loop of Vox static. Within it, buried like a bone under sand, was a voice. Distorted. Faint. Female. Repeat. This is Lucerna Outpost. Listening. Is anyone left? Then it cut to static again. The commander said nothing for a long moment. Then, alive? Possibly, or it's a trick, a recording. We'll know soon. The commander turned back to the stars. A faint glow had begun to rise at the edges of the screen, a slivered light that came not from the sun, but from the debris field that circled it, metal fragments and wreckage stretching like a crown around the dead world below. Lucerna. The name stirred something old. A beacon station, a listening post for forgotten wars. He left the bridge without a word, walking the broken corridor that once bore the proud banners of their company. Now only tattered threads remained, black and silver, dancing softly in the recycled air. He passed the chapel, sealed now, its altars burned bare, and came to the armory, where the last of the survivors were preparing in silence. They looked at him, not as a hero, not as a commander, just as the one still standing. He spoke. We land in 40 minutes. Standard formation, minimal thrust, no signals. A few nods. One brother, Marek, tightened the grip on his blade. His left hand was gone, replaced by a crude mag clamp fashioned from wreck metal. He had never once complained. Loran joined him at the side, slipping on his helm. If it's a trap, then we spring it, the commander said. They boarded the drop pod together, the doors closing with a hiss of finality. The launch was rough, the descent through the debris field violent. Metal screamed against their shell as fragments scraped and struck, and for a moment it felt as though the Vigil herself reached out, clawing at them to stay. Then silence. The pod landed hard. Earth and dust exploded outward in a plume of grey. They emerged into a world that felt like the inside of a memory. The sky was dim, painted in hues of copper and shadow. The sun filtered through thick, unnatural clouds. The air tasted of metal. Lucerna lay ahead, a spire half collapsed, its antennae crooked, the surrounding outbuildings nothing more than skeletal frames. No movement, no signs of life. They advanced slowly, weapons drawn but not raised. Every step felt loud, even in the silence. The commander moved at the front, eyes scanning, mind reading the battlefield as if it still lived. Then the voice again, stronger this time, from the Vox. If anyone hears this, respond. Lucerna outpost holds survivors. Loran stopped. That's live, the commander signaled. They moved into the main spire. Dust fell from above as they passed through the broken doorway. Inside, light flickered from shattered consoles. Machines still pulsed with faded glow, and in the center of it all, motion. A figure stood, human, thin, wrapped in a faded technician's uniform, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You're real," she whispered. Behind her, others emerged. 3, maybe 4, all thin, alive somehow. Loran stepped forward, lowering his weapon. "You sent the signal?" The woman nodded, hand trembling. "We didn't think anyone." The commander studied, her. "What happened here?" "Collapse," she said. "We lost contact after the heresies. Supplies stopped. The storms never ended. The others..." She trailed off. Loran glanced at the commander. "We can extract them." The commander did not reply immediately. He looked around at the room, at the faint glow of failing machines, at the faces watching with hollow hope. Then he nodded. "Call in the Vigil. Prepare the bay." Loran gave the order. The survivors, few and worn, would be taken. The Vigil would hold them, even in her broken shell. But as the commander looked once more at the stormed sky above, something in him shifted. Not resolve, not hope. Something quieter, a flicker of meaning beneath the ashes. Not victory, but something that moved toward it.